we like to call it the Supernatural Hour. And now, our hosts.
Hey, welcome to the Supernatural Hour podcast. I'm your host, Raven.
This is Doc.
This is Chad.
And we have a guest with us. Before I introduce the guest, Emmett and Rogue just couldn't make it today. They had some things pop up, so they will be here with us next time. But we have with us today Murda.
We got to get to the main topic. It's not like it's complex or deep.
All right.
No, not at all.
All right. We're going to talk about alchemy today. When you guys think of alchemy, I mean, don't go into what you've researched, but just first thought. Alchemy.
Lead to gold.
Okay.
My first thought was exoteric or esoteric.
Yeah, whatever.
So there's that.
So, Murda, just if I say alchemy, do you have any thoughts that that come to your head?
Something that changes into something else.
Okay. So, apparently I have the brain of like a 12-year-old child, because when I first heard of alchemy, not first heard of it, but when I thought, oh, alchemy, that would be a good topic, I thought of two things. One, Harry Potter, Sorcerer's Stone.
Oh,
There's the Harry Potter reference, the movie reference. Okay.
The other thing is, several years ago, on one of my first cell phones, you know, like in the mid-90s, I had an alchemy game, and it was really fun, and I can't find it, and I'm sad.
An alchemy game.
There's a game, and it was really cool. The runes they were black, and then they would light up, and then I don't even remember how it worked. Like, you had to clear the board of all the red ones, and I don't remember, but it was really fun, and I can't find it, and I'm sad.
It was like Candy Crush, but with mercury and sulfur.
With deadly materials.
Yeah, exactly.
It kind of dabbled more into the runes. Yeah, I just need to go take a nap. Okay.
Yeah, don't Candy Crush with the mercury.
Yeah, nope.
When I was little, kids would bring mercury to school and play with it on their desk.
Just for fun.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, really?
Yeah.
And then they all...
And I wouldn't play it on my desk. I'd roll it around in my palm.
That is what's wrong with you.
That explains a lot, doesn't it?
That explains everything. Okay. So, no, seriously. So, alchemy. It's a doctor thing. Doc, we'll let you kind of
It's
start
a
off.
doctor thing.
It's a pre-doctor thing.
What I know about alchemy, it's a precursor to chemistry and modern medicine in a lot of ways. It was practiced pretty widely throughout the world, places in China, India, Egypt.
They say it originated in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. And the
I
best...
have a whole list of history.
Oh, well...
But
my
you go.
goodness.
You go.
I was going to say the form I think that most people recognize or identify as European variant of alchemy.
Mm-hmm.
That's the
Well, maybe the most people in China recognize the
Probably.
Chinese variant.
Most people here in the United States, maybe. That's the whole sorcerer, wizard, scientist, whatever you want to call them, sitting in a lab mixing chemicals and poof and trying to take that base material, that lead, and transmute it into gold, into a more noble substance.
Yeah, so one of the things that I found was basically the idea of alchemy, precursor to a little bit more legitimate science. I hate to say that. This is when people were trying to science but didn't have the knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
But basically it was the process of taking something ordinary and turning it into something extraordinary in a way that couldn't be explained. And, they were noticing scientific things, but they didn't have the prior knowledge to understand why some of these things were happening. And here's a really good example. I wrote my notes, so this will be super exciting of how well I can read them. So there was a Greek, and I'll go through my list of history in just a second. We have a joke about lists, Murda, so they say I always have lists. I really don't, but I kind of always do. So,
no, if they're just written down things in lines, they're not really lists.
They're bullet points. It is a bullet point. Okay. So here's an example of kind of the thought process. So this would be kind of in the Greek era. So there was an alchemist. His name was, I don't speak Greek, Empedocles.
Close enough.
Run with it, folks. So he would light a stick on fire, okay? And, they've got the elements. They figured out the elements: air, water, fire, earth. So, they had decided on those, kind of fought about which one was the main element. But for the point of this discussion, he would light a stick on fire, And he would say, since the stick burns, it contains fire. Okay. And then they said, and now it leaves a residue. After it burns, it leaves that, soot, what we would call soot. So therefore, it contains earth. Mm-hmm. So the stick has fire, the stick has earth. And then they said, the residue is damp, so there's water in the stick. Okay. And then the fourth thing, they said the burning stick gives off smoke, therefore air is present. So, you can see they're trying to figure things out.
Right.
They just didn't quite have it on the mark. So that is part of alchemy, is the elements and how the elements deal with each other.
Okay, wait a minute, Ravi. I need to quiz you on something.
Okay.
What is the word alchemy? What does it mean?
Ooh, I know this. There's actually two different... there's two... Hang on. Okay, if you don't go in order of my notes, then you have to wait. So it's actually an Arabic word.
Yes, that's why I thought you might know it.
Which is alchemia. It's also thought it could come from a Greek word.
And what does alchemia mean in Arabic?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Hang on, I wrote it down because I did look it up. I don't know all the Arabic words. I just know some of the Arabic words. Hang on, don't tell me.
Okay, so should I tell you what I heard?
No.
Okay.
No, you can tell us what you heard.
And you may find it different in your notes, but the one that I went through, I think the al, what does al mean?
Al means the.
Okay. And chemi is Kish, which is the ancient name for Egypt. So it's the Egypt. That's where the origin of alchemy came from, is the way that I understand it. Now, you may have some other information.
If I look at my list, which I just found.
I thought you didn't have a list.
I do have a list. Sometimes I don't have lists and you say I do, but this is an actual
list.
Is an actual
verifiable list.
This it has bullet points that I wrote with my pen.
That is a list.
I won't be able to read what I wrote. Okay. So basically they kind of consider Egyptians to be the first alchemists, at least as far as they have any record of. So, you're thinking, they're saying 2000 BC. I'm actually studying ancient Egypt right now. Ancient Egypt goes back to like 6000 BC, but I digress.
But I think 2000 BC is pretty ancient in and of itself for us. I can go with
4,000 years ago.
You can go further back and it's even more ancient, but I would be okay with calling 2000 BC as ancient.
When you're contemplating the nature of things 4,000 years ago and burning sticks, and I guess that was in Greece, but still...
No, it was in Egypt, but it was Greek. It was the Alexander the Great influence in Egypt at the time.
There you go.
In the realm of ancient Egypt, 2000 BC is actually pretty new.
Yeah, like someone said...
But we digress.
I know, we're going to digress a little more, but I heard that Cleopatra lived closer to our age than she did to the building of the pyramids.
Yes, she did.
So, you think about that and how far, the pyramids go back in ancient Egypt, and we were just there. That is such a long culture, 6,000 years, and that Cleopatra is closer to our time than she was to the building of the pyramids.
Oh, that's crazy.
Anyway.
Back to alchemy. So Egyptian alchemists, in this whole process of trying to take one thing and turn it to another thing, they tried to make gold by painting the surface of lead with egg yolk. And some people think that alchemy comes from the Greek word that means Egyptian art, because how they would try to change that. And
okay.
I'm going to say, if you can take egg yolk and paint it on lead
and get gold.
Make gold, we need to go get some lead because we have a lot. I'm sending Murdo home with eggs today because we have a lot of eggs. I hope you like eggs.
You're rich.
Raven picked up 2 new chickens, so
oh, sweet.
we are chicken ranchers.
Chicken farmers.
Okay, I guess chicken ranch has a different connotation.
I get to go chicken farm. In fact, I was almost a little late to my own podcast because one of my chickens escaped and I had to go put it back.
Nice.
Moving on. So then kind of the next era of alchemy would be the Greek and Romans, which would be, roughly 600 BC to 500 AD. They kind of took what the Egyptians had a little bit, kind of ran with that. But the interesting thing about the Greeks is they thought that as far as science, theory was more important than the actual application of the science. It's kind of like they were thinkers, not so much doers.
They're academics.
Let's just think about
They're
the science.
long-time academics.
We'll get nothing done.
They go way
but we'll
back.
think about it.
We'll think about it a lot.
We'll think about it, but we're not actually going to apply it.
It's like in The Wizard of Oz, where, the great thinkers, they don't do anything, but they think.
That's right.
So then the next phase would be like the medieval Europe and Islamic states, which is interesting because they're kind of opposite. So obviously in the Dark Ages, science suffered. Things were happening that in ways that science didn't happen. You all know about that.
Because science was heretical at that time.
Mm-hmm. One of the things was, at the time, only monks could read. And so they only kept the science that didn't go against what science may have been in the Bible. So anything new or anything different than what the Bible said, they just discounted.
Or even if the Bible didn't say it, but it was the common belief of the church, like the earth was the center of the universe, and to have, the earth revolve around the sun, that's heresy.
Right. And so because of that, in Europe, a lot of, what little breakthroughs they made in science, like you can't put egg yolk on lead and get gold, kind of went away. But luckily, the Islamic scholars who dealt a lot with the Greeks, they kept the work going and extended it. The problem is there wasn't a lot of exchange with the East and the West until after the Crusades. And so, that knowledge didn't get back into Europe for quite some time.
There was some exchange between the East and the West with the Crusades. It just wasn't an exchange of knowledge.
It wasn't exchange.
Exactly.
It wasn't friendly.
It wasn't, hey, do you want to sit down and talk about science?
Nope.
There was none of that. We were at Saladin's palace, just fun fact. He was the Islamic half of the Crusades. Anyway.
Part of the Crusades, because they went for like 100 years.
Well, but he's probably
or more.
He's probably the most popular.
Yeah, no, he was
Islamic.
one of the greatest Islamic generals.
The headphones hurt my ears. Okay, I'm good. We're all good. I'm back.
We're all good now.
It's been a bad day. Okay, so China, about the 1000 AD era, they actually were very innovative in sciences. Because remember, you're like, I thought we're talking about alchemy. Why are we talking about science? But basically, alchemy was the precursor, right? So as we all know, most people know, China really came up with some very innovative things like gunpowder, tanks, all sorts of incendiary devices. But just because of how China was and can kind of still be, what happened in China stayed in China.
Very isolationist.
So that didn't really get out either. So then we get to about 1350 AD, and glass blowing among the Romans became very, very popular. The Romans had this information that had been lost, but the Arabs returned it. They're like, hey, you don't know this, but we do because we kept it going. And so it was actually the Arabs, the peoples, that actually started sharing this information. But what's important about glass blowing is a lot of modern chemistry cannot be done on any medium except for glass. Otherwise, it just...
The acids eat through, it reacts, it does all sorts of things.
Exactly.
So that's why, glass blowing is so important. But again, at that time...
Glass is fairly inert. It's silicone, right? It's basically just silica or sand that's been heated to the point that it liquefies and then resolidifies harder and less reactive.
But see, that would be considered the alchemy that we might be thinking of it, because they're taking sand, turning it into glass.
Something that's
transmuting it
clear,
into something different.
Liquefying it,
yes. And they're not understanding quite yet. They're just, if we do this, then this happens. And they still weren't quite understanding the science behind it. They were getting there. But to them, it's like, we're taking sand, we're turning it into glass.
Crystal. Basically.
And it's kind of magic.
It is kind of magic.
Exactly.
Yeah, they didn't understand necessarily the
principles.
The principles and the reasons that it did, but they were able to develop processes that would make that happen.
Yep. Yeah, so what we call science, they called alchemy. So now let's get to the 1600 AD. Okay, this is when the witch trials were happening. This is where they kind of took everything and changed it from, very black and white, light and dark, good and evil. If you made magic things happen, you were a witch. And so, good things were natural, evil things were from the devil. If you didn't understand it, it was evil, it was witchcraft. And so, a lot of things kind of didn't get lost, but they got shoved under.
They became occult.
They had to go underground,
Yes.
exactly.
And occult meaning hidden, not evil.
I'm glad you made that distinction, because so many times you hear the phrase occult and everybody just thinks evil, Satan
evil.
worship. All occult means is hidden.
Right.
I look for occult blood in things.
But
hidden
you
blood.
have evil blood?
You have evil. Sorry, I found occult blood in your stool sample. You have evil blood. Sorry about that.
It is kind of evil if it's in your stool sample.
It just means hidden. Yeah, but anyway.
right.
I digress.
So, but the interesting thing is about this same time, not too far, in the Tudor era in England, astrology, natural magic became really, really popular. Kings, knights, lords really got interested in, alchemical experiments. That was really hard to say. I don't know why.
And this would have been after Henry VIII broke from the Roman Catholic Church?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Queen Elizabeth, his daughter, was a patron of a project to discover the elixir of life, as was the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. And they really, astrologers were really, really listened to at the time, because ships wouldn't leave port if astrologers said, oh, Mercury is ascending and blah, blah, blah. And I'm not making fun of it. I just don't know it.
The waters are dangerous.
Yeah, if astrologers said, don't go out, the ship's like, we're not going out. Where now, if you told a ship, hey, the astrologer said, they're going to be like, yeah, whatever, I don't care.
Yeah, what does the meteorologist say?
Exactly. I'm going to go with a meteorologist, actually. But it's true, there's a lot more reliance on that. I don't want to say pseudoscientific, but the aspect of it that is not so much exoteric meaning the physical, seen, understandable, lead to gold process, where this is more esoteric, which is knowledge that is only understood by a small group of people. That's where kind of this whole idea of astrology and all of that comes into play,
and held by them purposely as a small group of people.
Yeah, and that wisdom is imparted to only groups of prepared individuals, basically.
So I've got two more. 16 to 1700s was kind of the fall of alchemy. That's when King James came into the throne, and up until now, alchemists were kind of referred to as magicians and sorcerers.
Well, like Isaac Newton was an alchemist. Lots of Galileo, lots of the scientists that we do, they also were alchemists.
Right. But because they didn't know how everything was happening, they inserted a lot of its magic into it, which is why they got these names. But King James hated magicians, hated them. And many of these alchemists had gotten very wealthy, because people were coming to them and make this and this elixir and, that and blah, blah, blah. And so when King James came around, they actually had to hide, and they had to live in poverty because they would have been killed otherwise. But about this time, too, because of King James, the more physical, provable sciences started becoming more popular, especially with the nobles. Although a lot of the physical science were based on these previous alchemy, because alchemy was just science before science, right?
Well, and then they, when you observe things, you learn things.
Right.
And you might not understand the underlying things underneath it. One of the things I bring up a lot of times is scientifically they couldn't explain how bumblebees flew until relatively recently.
Right.
They didn't have the computing power to really figure it out. But it's obvious that bumblebees fly.
Right.
But just because
based on their mass and their wing size, this doesn't seem
it doesn't compute.
Possible.
Right.
But it happens.
Right. Now, one of the differences between, the alchemy, and you can't see my air quotes, and, these new physical
chemistry.
The new physical sciences, was even though they were based on the alchemy theories, they used reason and logic rather than like the feelings and magic. They went more to the more pure science rather than the touchy-feely.
Yeah, and I think with some things in alchemy, and of course the changing, one element to another element can only be done in like nuclear reactors now. But there are things that that they could change, and they could change them regularly and repeatedly with certain processes that they had developed by observation over time, but they didn't understand the reason why it worked.
Right.
And so in a way, it was a magic. It was a, we don't know why when you do this happens.
Right.
But it happens.
But instead of default, it's magic. It's we don't know yet, but we're trying to
understand
that out.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing is there is still modern alchemy.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one in particular, it didn't have his name, but there was an alchemist in London in World War II, and he was offering medications when people didn't have health care. And, he was actually doing quite some good work and helping people, but unfortunately he was killed when a bomb fell in his lab. So he is no longer around.
That's interesting. So he was a modern exoteric alchemist, it sounds like, that he made medicinal preparations, and my understanding of it's fairly limited, but it does, a lot of times they'll go and pick certain plants during certain
seasons or times,
or astrological cycles, and they abide by their understanding of those laws,
right? And that astrological cycle might just be the time that somebody noticed that it's effective when Aries is in the third house, or whatever that was, and it was a time of year kind of thing of when you needed to do that, and then it was effective, and it might not be effective any other time, but it was an observation that they made that said, oh, if you do it.
Yeah, maybe this particular compound's in a higher concentration in the leaves during this part of the year, but they didn't. That's not how they just operated based on, I know during this cycle, during this phase,
it works better.
It works better.
Yep. So here's some other little interesting alchemical things. This makes me feel like I'm playing Minecraft. Have you ever watched kids play Minecraft? If you mix this and this and this, you get that. Anyway, again, I have a brain of a 12-year-old boy. Okay, so here's some things. They decided that fire and earth were dry, air and water were wet, fire and air are hot, earth and water are cold. And this is not a list. This is just stuff. Not a list.
Sounds like a list to me.
It is not a list. So they had 3 elements. The first one was salt. The second one was brimstone, which is sulfur. The third one is basically mercury. They called it quicksilver or a hydrogram.
I'm going to go with quicksilver.
Mercury. So basically mercury, sulfur, and salt. And they thought that from those 3 things they could create a lot of stuff. For example, they thought they could, and it was kind of based on the color and the properties. So sulfur is yellow, so they thought that they could get gold from sulfur because they had the same color.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of that sort of a thinking. And not just color, but like mercury, mercury is kind of shiny, kind of metallic. And silver, so all metallic things could come from that. And if it was gold and metallic, if you mixed sulfur and mercury together, you would get, you see what I'm going.
They were thinking here? If we get it in the right proportions and do the right things, we can get gold if we mix those.
As you're talking about, the root word chem for like chemistry or alchemy actually means to pour or to mix together. And chemistry and alchemy have that exact same root. When we talk about how alchemy was a precursor to chemistry, literally they share the same root based on the fact that they're pouring these things together to try to create
something
new
different.
Substances. Exactly.
Okay, fun fact. I never took chemistry in high school, but the chemistry teacher at our high school, her name was Mrs. Baum.
She was the bomb?
Yeah, it was B-A-U-M. And I never had her, I don't know. Anyway, but Mrs. Yeah.
I took too much chemistry.
Our chemistry teacher was Mrs.
Yes,
Baum.
Doc? Tell us.
Yeah.
Okay.
In college and high school.
But they also had spheres, and I thought these spheres were interesting. They had animal sphere, which was linked to Mercury, because they were more mobile in nature. Vegetation was linked to sulfur, and I don't have a little side note for that one. And minerals were linked to salt. And some of the people believed that all of creation was based on these spheres. So, you can see them starting to put some things together.
They're trying to rationalize. They're trying to categorize. Yeah,
It's the beginning.
The logic is a little shaky, but I get the effort. Like, I understand why they were like, okay, yellow, gold's yellow. We'll go with that. Like, it makes sense on a level, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think alchemy is interesting, and they say even today people practice alchemy through, Wiccans, practicing witches that use herbs and make elixirs, and it's still a thing.
Right. Well, and the esoteric alchemy, that's the philosophical or religious alchemy, is the stuff that I've taken more of an interest in than the exoteric. It's the same principles, but being applied to the self in a lot of ways. It's the idea of taking what is a base substance. We talk about the natural man in a lot of religious circles, and how you become a purified or better creature, essentially, right, through certain means. And so philosophical and religious alchemy is that kind of concept.
The changing from one state to another.
Right, going from a fallen state to a redeemed state, right? That is alchemy, really. It's esoteric alchemy. And that process occurs through what is known as the Philosopher's Stone. We talked about it a little bit. That was like when everyone says it's magic, that was the thing. It was like, okay, the thing that's going to turn the base material into a refined substance is the Philosopher's Stone. So every alchemist's goal in life was to figure out what the Philosopher's Stone was, to find the Philosopher's Stone. And when you look at it from a religious application, it's where it gets pretty fascinating, because then you start saying, well, what is it that takes me from fallen to redeemed, or from a lower state to a higher state in a religious context? And so some people would say, well, this is Christ, this is the atonement, he's the Philosopher's Stone. That's what makes us go from a fallen state to a redeemed state. And the process by which that happens is generally very private, very individualized. And one of the symbols that I really, really love, that's an alchemical symbol, is the beehive. And we live in Utah.
Yes, we do.
And our state flag is, it's got a beehive on it.
We are the beehive state.
And everyone goes, oh, it stands for industry. Kind of, maybe on a
certain level,
on a surface level, it does. But the esoteric meaning of the beehive is that's the place where the transmutation takes place, right? Because historically, bees would go into the hive and honey would come out, and they didn't know how that process happened. They just knew that bees would go in with raw material, and a refined golden substance would be created inside the hive.
And in many ways, a pure substance.
A pure, clear, purified
lasts
substance.
Forever.
It's sweet, it's eternal, it's golden, and it's a beautiful symbol for this transmutation. And so, from an esoteric standpoint, you see all these beehives everywhere on the flags. They're not really talking about industry. What they're talking about is the process by which you go from a base substance to a refined process. You can call that industry if you'd like. But it also symbolizes locations religiously, things like temples. And you'll see that a lot, especially here in Utah, where you see lots of LDS temples. If you look at the knobs on the Salt Lake Temple, for example, they have beehives on them. If you go and look at the Provo City Center Temple, there's beehives basically in all four corners of it. It's a symbol of a place where transmutation occurs, where you go from a lesser being to a higher being, essentially. It is esoteric alchemy at work. So I have a little bit of a passion for that aspect of alchemy.
No, that's awesome.
And so the exoteric stuff, I'm not so, good about how we're mixing sulfur and, mercury and making stuff.
Gold. You make your gold in a different way.
Right. But the philosophical stuff, and we can talk about, the symbol of the Philosopher's Stone, I don't know if I can describe it. It's a circle that has a square. So it's a circle inside a square that's inside a triangle that's inside another circle. And I don't know, maybe we can post a picture of it at some point.
We'll put it up. We'll put it up on the YouTube.
But it has very deep meaning. That inner circle of the Philosopher's Stone, the symbol of the Philosopher's Stone, represents the spirit, right? Inside, which it's circular, it's eternal, has no beginning and no end, right? And it is inside the square, which is four corners, represents the physical, which are the seasons, summer, fall, spring, winter, time. Look at the elements we just talked about, earth, fire, air, water.
Yep.
And so the square symbolizes our physical nature. So you've got your physical nature,
your spiritual
encased
nature.
your spiritual nature encased in your physical nature, basically. It's this idea of bringing those two opposites together inside a triangle. And a lot of people will look at that as either the Trinity, right? Which is, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Or if you want to break it down on a more universal level, the mind, the body, and the spirit. And that's kind of what gives you dimension. It gives your body and your spirit an opportunity for growth. And it's through that triangle, through that union of mind, body, and spirit, that the larger circle can occur. So the small circle can become enlarged, or you can go from a base individual or base spirit to a evolved higher level being. And so that's really, when you look at the symbol of the Philosopher's Stone,
that's the meaning?
On an esoteric level, that's what's being imparted, that's the process to go from a little circle to a big circle. And so take a look. If you have an opportunity to look at the symbol of the Philosopher's Stone, hopefully some of that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can do some science on yourself.
There you go.
Okay, awesome.
But go out and look at our TikTok and our YouTube and our social media, advancedparanormal.com to get there, and wisps.org. And that's kind of what's going on with those.
Yep. Well, stay spooky, my haunty friends.
Have a good one.
Hey, have a great evening.
Goodbye. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Supernatural Hour at advancedparanormal.com. The Supernatural Hour is part of the Radio Ronin network, found at radioronin.com. Copyright by Advanced Paranormal Services.